Day 19, Part 1. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Part 2A. Present. Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. Is Jorge to Japan by plane? Is Jorge traveling to Japan by plane? No, is Jorge traveling to Brazil? Where is Jorge traveling to? Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Is Jorge traveling to Manuel, his apartment? No, Jorge is traveling to Brazil. How is Jorge traveling? By plane. Jorge is traveling by plane. Is Jorge traveling by taxi? No, he's traveling by plane. Who's traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge is traveling by plane. Where is Jorge traveling to? Jorge by plane. Jorge is traveling by plane to Brazil. Part 2B. Past. Jorge was traveling to Brazil by plane. Does Jorge to Japan by plane? No, Jorge was traveling by plane. Jorge was traveling to Brazil. Where was Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Was Jorge traveling to Brazil? His Manuel? His apartment? No, Jorge was traveling to Brazil. How was Jorge traveling? To Brazil. By plane. Jorge is traveling by plane. He was traveling by plane. Was Jorge traveling by taxi? No, he was traveling by plane. No, by taxi. Who's traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge was traveling by plane. Where will Jorge traveling to? Brazil. Jorge will traveling to Brazil. Part 3A. Present. Jorge thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. Is Jorge things interesting culture Brazil? Boring? No. It's interesting. What is it? Interesting. Brazilian culture is interesting. The Brazil culture is interesting or boring? Interesting. The Brazil culture is interesting. Boring? No, interesting. World culture, what is interesting? To Brazil. Brazil culture is interesting. Part 3B. Paz. Jorge thought Brazilian culture is interesting. Did Jorge think Brazilian culture was boring? No, was interesting. The Brazilian thing that is interesting. What do you think? In Brazilian culture is interesting. Do you think that Brazilian culture is interesting or boring? It's interesting. Do you think the Brazilian culture is interesting? Part 4. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Sweden? No, he wants to live forever. Where does Jorge want to live? Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Does Jorge want to live in the Russia? No. Jorge didn't want to live in the Russia. He wants to live in Brazil. Who wants to live in Brazil? Jorge. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil forever? Yes, Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil one day? No, one day. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil for 1 month? No. He wants to live in Brazil forever. For 1 year? No, forever. Jorge he wants to live in Brazil forever. Part 5. Jorge, you're traveling to Brazil by plane. You think the culture in Brazil is interesting. You want to live in Brazil forever. In Brazil, you can learn the Portuguese language well. You can also be interesting people. We love Jorge. Personal question. You think is American culture is interesting? Yes, American culture is interesting. Culture is interesting. Interesting.